Underway this morning. LexisNexis, in association with the Law Society of South Africa, are hosting yet another webinar in the State of the Legal Industry series. It's based on important and valuable insights contained in the Legal Tech Report 2021-2022. It's an important body of research compiled by LexisNexis South Africa in partnership with the Law Society. And let me just remind you, its primary aim is to contribute towards the development of the legal profession using critical data and insights to shape a way forward. If you haven't got your hands on a copy of that report yet, you can find the download link in the chat box throughout the session, and LexisNexis will also share it with all attendees straight after this webinar. It does make for very interesting and important reading. It looks at everything from the impact of COVID-19 in the approach to technology within the profession, gender and race transformation in the industry, networking and marketing shifts, and a whole lot more. The last webinar that we had in this series, State of the Legal Industry, focused on the topic of legal in the digital age. I thoroughly enjoyed hosting that, and I like to think that some important insights were gained from that. It is available on our LexisNexis South Africa YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be looking at another vital and important topic: how to thrive in a post-pandemic working world. The Legal Tech Report 2021-22 offered some interesting insights into the hardest hit areas of practice post-COVID-19. 60%, let me repeat that, 60% of our respondents said that their law firm or practice was grossly impacted by the pandemic. The pandemic has also, I would contend, had a much broader impact in terms of general workplace management, covering operations in the HR space, facilities management space, and a whole lot more. And today, colleagues, I want to deep dive into why we have seen these general shifts that have happened, and perhaps more importantly, what the long-term impact is likely to be, particularly as people start to go back to work in one way or another. In that respect, a little later on in this session, I will be putting a poll up to gauge exactly where you and your company are in that specific space. Let's get to that in just a moment. Some of the questions that I will be putting to our experts today: is your workplace prepared for life after the pandemic? Do you have the right systems and processes, I wonder, in place to maintain a safe, happy and healthy working environment, and perhaps most importantly, a productive working environment post the pandemic? And how prepared are you, I wonder, for further changes to HR and labor law that is inevitably going to come in this new era that we are living in? You're very welcome to send questions to any of our panelists. You use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I've got my eye on it right now, and I'll keep an eye on that throughout the session. For now, though, I'd like to welcome, a warm welcome to our panel members who have joined us. Jason White is a member of the Law Society of South Africa Labour Law Committee, director at the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright South Africa Inc., along with Andrew Mason, who is from a workplace fundi. He has over 30 years experience on the front line of managing facilities and workplaces. And our third panel member this morning is Siphamandla Ngcobo, who is a content coordinator here at LexisNexis South Africa. To all of you, thank you for joining us today. A very warm welcome, and I am looking forward to hosting this conversation. Andrew Mason, let me get to you first of all. How are South African businesses in general, I wonder, coping with key shifts that we've seen in the workplace and facilities management space as a result of the pandemic? And perhaps also apply your mind to what some of those key shifts are. And I think word of the year is going to be unmute, if you wouldn't mind doing that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, Jeremy. Thank you to everybody. I think we've adapted quite well to remote work, certainly during the pandemic, but I think that was largely due to what other choice did we have, and that everybody was in the same boat. You know, just to throw some stats, even prior to COVID, only 13% of employees were satisfied with their work experience, and only 53 agreed that their workplace actually allowed them to work productively. And in fact, 30% of employees actually disagreed with that statement. So Following the working from home experiment, that figure is probably nearer 75% now. So as we look to the future and we look more to a hybrid approach, I think that's a word that's come into our lexicon more and more. Whether you have a choice to go back to work or not, the jury is out because it's early days. Because unfortunately, I think the information that we have right now is largely apocryphal, as we lack local data in South Africa on what is happening and how our organizations are dealing with this return to work on a macro scale. This for me leads to two issues that I believe we need to be very careful of. Firstly, that we risk looking and adopting an Amero or a Eurocentric approach, because this is generally where all the data is coming from. And consequently, the data and trends don't take into account our local issues, infrastructure, our unique socioeconomic challenges, the glory of ESCOM, security, and even the issue and the rise of gender-based violence during the pandemic in the home setting. And secondly, despite data that we've got from the annual CEO benchmarking report that says over 50% of CEOs say that employee performance is their highest concern, and the idea of working well remotely is their biggest challenge, I'm finding that organizations seem to be sitting on the fence and are looking at what others are doing before they will move. They don't seem to want to make that first jump. This is despite clear evidence that we've seen in the Stoddart report that calculated that improving the workplace experience in the UK setting would increase GDP nationally by as much as 5 to 7%. So I believe our organizations need to read the room if they're going to prepare for an upturn, to make the most of first mover advantage if they really want to survive in this new world of work.
Quick question. When you talk about working productively, do we have a good definition of what working productively is?
No, I mean, I think what is in our industry, we look to a thing called the Leesman Index, and you can go and Google that. And they talk about this idea of working productively, and it is a self-assessment. And there are issues with that. But how do you, for instance, how do you work productively in a lawyer's office is very different from how you would work productively in an advertising agency. So it does come down to the individual. And I think one of the things that we should learn from all of this is it's going to be a one-size-fits-one approach, and it has to be done within the realms of your building, I think. And you shouldn't be looking to other institutions, either your competitors or your colleagues, as to what they're doing, because I think it is very, very individual to your own corporate DNA.
Suffice it to say that you have a reasonable definition of what it means in terms of your own company or your own sector.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one thing, if one thing good has come out of this pandemic is, I think prior to, in my experience, before the pandemic, people didn't actually know whether they were productive or not. And I think the whole idea that productivity has now been brought front and center. So I think, that is definitely a positive for most organizations. Have understood what it means to be productive.
Andrew, I'll get back to you in just a moment. Thank you very much indeed. Jason White, I'm assuming that labor laws the world over have changed and have also struggled perhaps to keep pace with the changes that have been brought on by the pandemic that we still continue to live with. So in terms of a legal and regulatory framework, how are we doing in South Africa, Jason? Are we keeping pace?
Well, thanks, Jeremy. It's a very important question. So South Africa has been quite active in regulating, and I think we probably all agree over-regulating the response to COVID-19 in traditional workplaces. So we've got a number of legal instruments such as the Code of Good Practice. There's new regulations under the Health Act, which tell us exactly what we as employers must do when our employees come into the office or walk onto the factory floor. So we now know how far away from one another employees must be. We know when people must wear masks. We know what must happen when they contract COVID or have symptoms and need to go into isolation. But where there is a massive gap or lacuna in our regulatory framework is the remote or hybrid workplace. And I think the regulators and governments has been very hesitant to start encroaching into that private space. So we have a largely unregulated environment. It's been left essentially to private employers to regulate those workplaces through policies and so on. And my experience is that, say with the very large corporates, we haven't seen a very big uptake of that particular challenge. And I think that feeds into what Andrew is saying, is that there's a lot of hesitance to be the person that moves first, the person that comes up with the creative ideas, because with all creative ideas, it can have a knock-on effect to the profitability of your business. So I think we do have to look at what's happening overseas, where they are maybe a little bit further up the chain. Some very interesting ideas on regulating who can work from home and when. How does one go about measuring productivity? What happens, for example, if some of your employees say, well, I would like to go work from overseas. There's no reason why I can't do my normal attorney's tasks from a foreign jurisdiction. What about that? And I think we need to be quite proactive about how we manage that. So I'd really encourage those employers that are viewing this webinar to start thinking about those policies and how we go about being creative into the future.
Now, finish your thought.
So just a couple of other examples I can throw around just to get the creative juices flowing is when we talk about workplace safety, well, what do we actually mean when we start talking about a home workplace? We've seen cases coming out in European jurisdictions where people have had workplace accidents at the home. Is the employer liable? How do you discipline remote workers? What if your remote worker is committing some sort of fraud whilst in the home workplace? How do you deal with those sort of things? So I think we need to grapple with these issues. I don't think it's been done a lot within South Africa other than certain big corporates. And but we need to be more proactive about that. Thanks, Jeremy.
Jason, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's such a blurred space at the moment. For all I know, you could be sitting with your, facing a beach in Malta, and we wouldn't know that. That's the dynamic that we're working with at the moment. Two quick follow-ups. One is, if we have this unregulated environment, broadly, what is the impact? And if we were to start looking at policies, where would you begin, even if they're with a light touch?
I think we need what we see proactive employers doing is doing surveys of their employees and finding out exactly how they want to work. There's a massive push, it's fueling concepts like the Great Resignation, that employees don't want to work an 8-hour, 5-day-a-week job anymore. They want to work differently. So I think getting a sense of what our employees want to do, that will guide us in the way that we formulate our policies. We also have to be quite clear, because at the end of the day, we have responsibilities as businesses to make sure that we are meeting customer demand through hybrid or remote working. If there are certain tasks that have to be done in the office, I think we have to face up to that and realize that we can't just simply jettison all of the old ways in favor of potential new ways that might not be that effective. So I think start having a conversation with your employees, do surveys, they are helpful, and be receptive to new ideas. Yeah.
Talking of surveys, let's put up the LexisNexis poll if we can. And essentially, the points that Jason and Andrew have just raised are going to inform that poll. Sipa Mandla, I'm going to come to you in just a moment. but 3 very quick questions. 1, have you downloaded the Legal Tech Report? It's a yes or no, obviously. What working model has your organization embraced? We've been talking about this hybrid working, fully remote working, or full-time work in your usual work environment, as Jason says, back to the office. And 3, do you subscribe to any products for guidance on the do's and don'ts of HR and facilities management? Again, as Jason was pointing out, have the conversation, but it's very important, of course, that that conversation is informed by as much information as you possibly can. Thank you very much indeed. We'd be very grateful if you would fill out the poll. It also helps us shape and tailor intelligence coming out of webinars like this, and obviously informs future events that we're going to do as well. Let me move now to Siphamandla Ngobo from LexisNexis. Siphamandla, good morning to you. So the relevant legislation then that employers need to be mindful of when building a so-called post-pandemic workplace. Maybe summarize that for me if you can in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jeremy. Welcome, everybody. And thanks for having me in the session. So I think, yeah, the 2 relevant ones that I can actually think of, and Jason did kind of touch on them before, is they published in terms of the health and safety, which is the hazardous biological agents regulations. And another one is the code of practice on managing exposure of COVID in the workplace. So what it simply is the hazardous biological agents regulations, I think it replaced the hazardous chemical agents regulations, which were published in 2020. But what they do is they take into consideration the coronavirus as part of the viruses and as part of the risk group within the hazardous biological agents regulations. And what that simply means is that it places the responsibility on the employer to kind of give, to kind of provide that healthy and safe work environments when it comes to the employees, you know. So it places that legal responsibility on the employer. And it's been categorized, I think, as a 3V group within the hazardous biological regulations, which and the V simply means that it has a vaccine available for it. And then the 3 is it's a pathogen that may cause serious human disease in the workplace. And that's the category around it. And then another one that I want to touch on is the code of practice on managing exposure in the workplace. So the code is similar to the directive that was published, I think, in June of 2021. But I think since we were taken out of that state of disaster, a lot of legislation that Jason touched on before, there was a whole lot of legislation that came in during the state of disaster was taken away and fell away when we were released from the state of disaster, and then this code of practice was actually published. And the code, I think the code just what it simply wants to do is it helps in developing a plan when it comes to limiting infections. You know, it further highlights as just that inspector responsibility when it comes to monitoring and enforcing the rules outlined in the code. What it tries to do as well, what it tries to seek to do as well is to kind of accommodate employees who I think we've seen have kind of refused to take the vaccine, you know, and it seeks to also accommodate employees who may feel like, you know what, in our workplace, it's not so safe. It's not such a safe environment. I don't feel safe when it comes to it. So those are the things that I think are outlined within within the code itself. And then I think a key outline out of it is that it helps employers kind of put together a proper risk assessment plan, you know. And then it outlines what it is that risk assessment plan should entail, and it further kind of gives suggestions as to if you are working or if you do want to kind of mitigate those risks of infections, these are the things that you should do. So if you've got like maybe facilities or you've got a way in which workers can actually work from home, then actually that is encouraged, you know, social distancing, hygiene and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically what it is. But I think a lot of detail sits within that code of practice that's published in terms of the health and safety.
So let me say this, and it's a very apt question from Abigail Munsami. Abigail, thank you very much indeed. And this is directed at you, Siphamandla. Codes of practice, she says, are not obligatory. would one then be in breach if the employer does not heed to the code? And I guess leading on from that, it's always difficult to enforce a code of practice, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it definitely is a difficulty to enforce that code of practice. But I think one of the things that are highlighted within the code of practice is what I touched on before, which is that inspector part of it. Inspector can come in. I think inspector is given certain rights and certain certain rights in terms of the law to actually come into your workplace and evaluate your workplace. And make certain recommendations. And I think one of the stuff that's actually mentioned within the health and safety, which is section 30, is that inspectors can actually come in and, just in a production company, they can actually put certain facilities and red tape certain facilities because they're not, they're not deemed as health and safety. So they've been given that right to actually enforce this, to actually monitor to make sure that this code is actually adhered to. And I think the biggest thing around it and the biggest, the biggest sort of tone around it and the biggest thing that's actually repeated is the fact that there needs to be a risk assessment plan, and that risk assessment plan, workers are actually obligated to adhere to it. So yeah, I think in terms of everything, I think, and in terms of enforcing that code of practice, it can come from the inspectors, and think workers have been given that sort of that sort of code to actually, you need to apply for it, you need to apply by it or abide by it, and you also need to make sure that you abide by the rules that have been set up by the workplace, by the employer.
Andrew Mason, let me come back to you, and let me preface it by saying I think that the train is gathering momentum. Traditional workplaces now have to contend, it's a reality in their lives, that employees would much prefer working from home. I'm sitting in my writing room. I have my sheepdog at my feet. I have a kettle very close to me. I'm very happy today. I'm warm, I'm cocooned. I don't want to go into the office. So I'm assuming then that it is critical now for employers to create a better workplace environment / experience. Do you agree with me? And if so, what is that experience?
Absolutely. I think I would just go one step back though first. I think all too often we're being presented with this as a polarizing zero-sum game with people swapping out the office for home. We need to be very careful and understand that at workplaces, and then we're talking about perhaps the legal fraternity as a corporate workplace, but I mean where we have to produce products, etc., that is not necessarily available to them. We need to be very careful and understand that working from home is not for everybody all of the time for all tasks, because if we don't, we're swapping one set of problems for another. Commuting at the same time as everybody is clearly a ridiculous and an anachronistic thing now to do, but so too is locking oneself away in a home office or a dining room or your bed set, with its isolations, its lack of ergonomics, amorphous routines, and only connecting with our colleagues through a two-dimensional virtual interface. Both issues have been laid bare over the past year and a half, and we're seeing cognitive fatigue as well as other serious mental issues now materializing. So in my view, we need to see the home and office as collaborators, not necessarily competitors. The plethora of surveys that I think we've all seen probably conducted over the last year have all suggested, and one thing they have agreed on, and there isn't much they've agreed on, but one thing they have agreed on is there's only a single-digit percentage of people who want and can sustain a wholly remote routine. But one of the more recent ones done by Steelcase, which was actually done this year, shows that the key to achieving employee engagement and productivity is a very simple fact. It's whether or not people like their office. The workplace matters, and it matters in many ways that leaders don't realize. Steelcase came up with the following stats. Those employees in the corporate office are 33% more engaged, 30% more connected to their company culture, 20% more productive, and 9% less likely to leave. So the workplace we left 21 months ago is just not going to cut it in the new world of work. The evidence that we're seeing is clear. If your office performs on average or worse, you're going to struggle to get your employees willing to return. So if your workplace isn't working, your business is not going to be able to perform. So to go back, that idea of creating this workplace experience that you treat your employees as the retail industry treats their customers is definitely a competitive advantage. And I think that for me is the driver behind creating that workplace experience.
How do I know if my workplace isn't working?
I guess it comes down to productivity, or what I think it's a more rounded thing, what we call human performance. If we're talking about that sort of corporate space, and we can, and then there are other ways that we can judge workplaces, whether it's a retail area or whether it's a corporate workspace or whether it's what I call the old tech, which is a factory example. So it comes down to productivity, but it's a more rounded experience and it's understanding, can I compel these people to come? Yes, I can compel them. I mean, I'm not legally qualified. Jason can tell me whether I can do that, but rather, surely it's better to give them a compelling reason to come back. We are creatures of our environment. And if we're creatures of our environment, then providing that environment is going to improve productivity, is going to improve engagement, along with many other things. And I think this is why the workplace, everybody's had a little bit to do with the workplace, whether it's HR, whether it's IT, whether it's corporate real estate, whether it's facilities management, whether it's asset management. And I think we all need to come together and understand this is a much more holistic problem that we need to look at.
Jason White, let's pick up on that statement from Andrew Mason if we can. Can an employer compel me to go to work?
Well, as always, I don't think you're ever going to pin a lawyer down to a simple answer, and it is a complex issue. In general, the employer retains the right to choose the workplace in question. So if you need an employee to work in Belleville rather than Cape Town, well, as an employer, you retain the right to require that. The problem is that given that we've now been over 2 years down the line from when people moved out of the office and went home, many people have at least tacitly been allowed to go work in other cities. They've taken on other commitments and so on. So I think employers have to be quite careful about the way in which they compel their employees to return to the office. But looking at it from a more common sense point of view and less of a lawyer's point of view, if you compel people to work in an environment that they're not happy in, the reality is that they're going to resign, and the chances that they might go across to your competitors who offer a more flexible environment. So I keep on harping on about this, but I think keeping your ear to the ground, being more flexible, listening to your employees will make you a leading employer rather than the type of employer that harks back to sort of Dickensian times. Yeah.
It's back to that point that Andrew Mason made about making sure that there's an optimum working environment or an optimum working experience. Very quickly, Jason White, duty of care legally in the future then. Particularly when it comes to issues like health and safety, how do organizations need to pivot in that respect?
Well, we have to bear in mind that all of the traditional legislation regulating health and safety doesn't just disappear. The Occupational Health and Safety Act is still there. Sipamanda touched on a very important point that you do still have labor inspectors who are entitled to inspect and monitor workplaces. So if you have a home workplace, there's no reason why a labor inspector could not come around to your remote employees' homes and inspect it and ensure that they're working in a safe environment. Now, that has happened overseas. It hasn't, as far as I know, happened in South Africa, but it is something which we need to be aware of. As an employer, you are responsible for your own employees and you responsible for their health. But one very particular aspect, we've seen a massive uptick in psychological complaints, illnesses, mental breakdowns amongst employees who are working from home. So employers have to be aware that they are responsible for that environment as well. And if you create an environment where employees are simply forced out of the office into an environment where they're alone, they have no social capital or connectivity, and you don't take steps to ameliorate that in some way or another, you might well find that you are neglecting your duty of care to those employees on the psychological level. So again, always bear in mind that you are responsible as an employer, you are responsible for the health of your employees and must create within the boundaries of reason a safe workplace environment.
But difficult to manage those boundaries of reason when head office is in Johannesburg and someone's gapped it to the Karoo.
Yes, it's obviously going to be difficult in practice, and we have to take each matter on a case-by-case basis. So the employee that works in the Karoo, as long as they're doing that by choice and as long as they are within the boundaries of reason, working in a safe environment, that they're not working on faulty IT equipment that might electrocute them, then it's unlikely that employers are going to be found wanting there. My concern would be more with employees who are forced to work from unpleasant workplace environments at home. We've also got to bear in mind that it's not just the well-paid employees who are at risk here. It's often people who are in fairly lowly paid jobs, call center agents and so on, who might not have ideal working environments. So employers have to be very flexible there. Employers generally are required to conduct a risk assessment under the workplace codes. And I think that would be a good place to start in just having a bespoke type of approach to workplace safety.
Siphamanga Ngobo, the key word that Jason has just raised is, just trying to read my handwriting here. The key word that Jason has just raised is flexible. And I would suggest to you that it will become increasingly difficult for law and policy to keep change with the pace of the flexibility that Jason White is suggesting.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. But I think just in terms of that flexibility, I think it is important, and I think Jason did touch on this before, to keep your ear on the ground when it comes to that, you know. I think we've seen quite a lot of that are starting to paint sort of that framework of operation. We've seen a lot of cases that have come in just around vaccination, you know. That's just one example, and I think I can only presume that after that and after those cases have come in through the CCMA, we've seen a lot of dismissals happening due to incapacity, I think it is, or incapacitated actually. So I think just around that, it's very important to keep your ear on the ground. It's very important to see and actually publish new regulations that will make sure and ensure that they still keep within the health and safety environment. They still have that employer-employee relationship intact and have that sort of, and provide that health and safety when it comes to the work environments for the workers. So yeah, I think just in terms of legislation and everything, I think we can start to see a lot of those coming in, and part of keeping your ear on the ground is actually seeing what is coming in through the cases and seeing what sort of markers have been put in place that are starting to paint that framework of operation.
I'm trying to make this conversation as practical as possible for our participants today. So I want to ask you, Siphamanga, you say I've got to keep my ear to the ground. What am I listening out for?
I mean, listening out to system changes. I mean, so people like Jason, I think, would actually start to interpret the law and will start to interpret the code of practice, and will start to interpret the hazardous biological agents regulations that are published in terms of the health and safety. So you're keeping out for those interpretations, for those changes, you know, for those loopholes that you see within the law, for those loopholes that might cause that might infect that employer-employee relationship, for those loopholes or for those blind spots that I think weren't taken into consideration when drawing up the code of practice, you know. I think Jason did mention just the whole work from home and injury sort of perspective. And what that code has done is that it's kind of put that in place in terms of vaccination. So if you do fall ill in terms of vaccination, it's put that sort of you can go and claim with the compensation of occupational injuries and diseases. But what Jason has identified as a blind spot is, and this is, I think, just being in years and years of practice within this area, I think is one of, now if I'm injured at home, is that still considered the workplace? So it's actually identifying, I think, just those blind spots and identifying those changes that need to be put in place. And once we start to see, I think, the ball rolling and cases kind of coming up and cases kind of building up, we will start to kind of paint that proper framework that will put those that will now result in legislation actually being put in place.
All right, Andrew Mason, I'm going to get to you in just a moment, but Jason White, I'm delighted to say that you've kicked over a hornet's nest. So I want you to address two questions, pretty much the same actually, from Lynn van Aarde and from Yolandi, and I can't quite make out the surname on my screen. Lynn says, how can employers be held liable for health and safety issues at a home office? Employers can't be held responsible for what happens in my home. And Yolandi asked the question, just to make sure I understand correctly, are we to inspect all employees' home offices and environments in order to make sure, Jason, that it is a safe work environment? I'll hand that straight over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. And just to reassure everyone, there's obviously two competing principles in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. One is that employers must take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of their employees. I emphasize the word reasonable. But the second is that employees must also take reasonable steps to ensure their own safety. So it's a dual obligation, and employers are only required to do A, what is legally possible, and B, what is reasonable. Now, it remains untested in South Africa as to whether an employer would even have the right to inspect an employee's home. I think it would be a brave employer that tried to enforce that. But what we have seen on a more practical level is employers send around questionnaires, make sure that their employees have a chair that's fit to purpose or a workspace that is fit to purpose. And if not, then take some sort of remedial action. But just to go back to one example is with call center staff who, at the early stages of the lockdown, were forced to go home to, in some cases, informal settlements carrying IT equipment and were genuinely placed at physical risk. So it's not something that employers can just step away from as soon as the employee leaves the traditional workplace. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer that one can give. But at the same time, I emphasize that you're only required to take steps that are reasonable to ensure that your employees are safe. And if there are concerns, then act on them. Yeah.
Just a quick one from Trudy Truscott. She has a question regarding work from home office employees. Is it sufficient, she asks Jason, that an employer only provides a risk assessment for the at-home office? Or is there more that's required?
Well, the requirements, and Siphamandla will probably be able to confirm this, is the code requires employers to conduct a risk assessment, and then you must produce a workplace plan. And that will set out exactly the type of steps that employers must take or would want to take. And what I generally try and encourage clients to do is be more expansive in terms of what they're putting into their risk assessments and their plans. So if they do have a large cohort of employees that are working from home, have the basic principles that are in place. It's not just, it goes beyond vaccination requirements. It goes into, are you handling confidential information from your home workplace? And those type of things. So anything that poses some sort of regulatory risk, I would like to see going into risk assessments and then making their way into the workplace plan that employers are required to produce.
Thank you. Siphamandla, would you like to expand on that? What, in your opinion, then needs to drive that risk assessment process?
I think just from maybe from an employee perspective, I think it needs to kind of, so once put together, because I think once an employer puts it together, they'll put it together with sort of like that view that would come from an employee perspective. But I think just from an employee perspective, I think it's very important to run it through your necessary touch points, which is maybe a trade union, a trade union representative, which would look at it from, does it actually benefit, my members, and would actually, look at it from a worker perspective. And I think it's also important, once putting together that risk assessment plan, to actually run it through maybe your health and safety committee that sits within the company. And I think they would be able to look at it from a worker perspective, and just make sure that, I think at the end of the day, you educate your employees, you educate your employees in terms of the COVID and the threats around it, and just provide them with enough information and awareness around the dangers of the virus. And how it's transmitted, and the measures and the limits in which you can put place to actually limit the transmission of the virus. So I think one important point is to make sure that once the employer puts it together, to make sure that it actually goes through multiple eyes before it actually becomes the law that has to be applied with that work.
And it's the multiple eyes and the multiple disciplines within an organization, depending on the sector, that's absolutely critical. Fani van Biljon says, for instance, would ergonomics training reduce the risk that employers face as in respect to the work from home environment? I mean, that's one aspect that you've got to look at. It could be critical, could it not, Zippo?
No, definitely. I think it's quite right. It could be critical. I fully agree with that.
Andrew Mason, let me come back to you. Here's a nice question. If you're working from home, there is the potential consequence of a loss in intellectual property. There is the gap possibly that comes with a lack of training given the remote location of employees. And this could result in a decline, one, of employee loyalty, but two, to the point that I think Jason White made a little earlier, it could feed in to this whole notion of the Great Resignation.
And it was interesting, this idea of the Great Resignation. There was actually an article last week in Business Tech that looked at this from a South African perspective. And yes, the Great Resignation is happening, but probably not on the scale that we see again across the pond. And again, that sort of emphasizes the difference, I think, in our situations.
Just remind us very quickly, Andrew, to interrupt.
Sure.
What is the Great Resignation for the uninitiated?
So the idea is that because I suppose the power pendulum has shifted towards the employee, and where they're not getting what it is they want from their employers, this idea of the gig economy, which has been on the rise since way before COVID, has said people are going, well, I want a better lifestyle balance. I want to be able to work from home. And if my employer is not going to allow me to work from home, then perhaps I can go and become a consultant, a gig worker, a contractor, or whatever it might be. And so this is this idea of the Great Resignation.
So let's get back to the whole thing of IP loyalty, the Great Resignation, as there is more remoteness. The cohesion within an organization is in danger of unraveling, is it not?
I agree. I mean, I think, the management has had to trust the staff to work from home for the majority of the last 2 years. So it seems strange to me that now that this sort of lockdown has been rescinded, many organizations are compelling and mandating their employees to return to work. This is only going to serve to break any of that precious trust that has been built. And that to me seems to be counterintuitive. As I've said previously, surely the best way is to provide a compelling reason for them to return to the work. And the catalyst to do this is the physical environment. Certainly, Jeremy, in your background, you'll be familiar with the quote that Theodore Levitt, I think, was said, that people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. For me, this talks to two things. This may sound slightly counterintuitive coming from someone who comes from a facilities management background, but my take on this since 2015, 4 years before the pandemic, has been that organizations actually don't want facilities. They want a productive workforce. Unfortunately, up until then, with the sort of the static computer and this, that, and the other. They had to corral them into that workplace. Now, with the abilities of technology, we don't need to do that. So I think that secondly gives the corporate real estate industry a huge predicament. You know, corporate real estate is a product-based industry that is now faced with trying to serve customers that increasingly want less space, along with the delivery of improved amenities and services that create that superior experience. So this, for me, is what's driving this integrated workplace and this IP that rests in the disciplines of facilities management, HR, IT, corporate real estate, supply chain, and finance. And they're going to have to come together under this idea of whether it's the chief workplace officer or some workplace team that has a far more holistic approach. And this is something that businesses in the workplace are going to have to deal with, as we have to start thinking about the people inside the box rather than the box itself. And then hopefully we'll go some way towards humanizing the workplace.
Jason White, and I'll put this question to Siphamandla Ngcobo as well. It's in terms of hours put in, and Corey Sutherland raises the issue. Where does South Africa stand on the right to switch off? In other words, to disconnect. It's taking the call from someone, and it's happened to me at 8:15 on a Sunday evening, and the answer is, oh, I didn't realize what the time was. Jason White, legally, where do we stand on that? It all seems to be very blurred to me at the moment.
Yeah, so legally, there's no specific right to turn off. There's no piece of legislation where you'd find that right. And there have been attempts elsewhere in the world to do exactly that. The reality is that employees are faced with any number of intrusions into their normal private life, whether it's WhatsApp or Teams and so on and so forth. Now, again, it is difficult to give a very general type of answer, but certain employees who earn in the lower earning category below what we call the earnings threshold of approximately 215,000 Rand per annum might be able to bring an argument that they're entitled to overtime pay if they are engaged in substantial work after hours. I think that would be quite an interesting argument to raise. But otherwise, I think when we look at better paid, higher paid employees, and more generally, I think it all comes down to the working environment. And the common sense approach is, well, do you want to be subjecting employees to the always on type of approach to doing work? I don't think that is sustainable, and certainly will lead to employees leaving if that is enforced. So again, I think employers need to cross that bridge on a voluntary basis, try have some sort of workplace policy. A lot of workplaces in South Africa are doing that for their employees, and I think that is an important development. Also bear in mind that employees must start enforcing or setting their own boundaries, and within reason they're entitled to do that.
I'm going to start closing this conversation, and Siphamandla Ngcobo, I'm going to come to you first of all as we start to future focus now, if we can. What then, in your opinion, are some of the changes in labor law that we can expect following the COVID crisis? What's on your antenna at the moment?
So, I mean, one of the things that I think has actually, or provision has been made for and outlined is the vaccination and rules and responsibilities around the vaccination. But I think we've seen quite a number of cases making their way to the CCMA. And I think just from each party, once you make your way to the CCMA, or once you make your way to the courtroom, that means from your understanding and from maybe your legal advice, you've been actually, there is some sort of notion that, you know what, this is some case that I could win in such a way, and these are the merits around that. But it clearly means that there's more improvement when it comes to legislation around that, and there's more improvements around, we can expect more improvements around just around the merits as to when it's actually supposed to be mandatory, when you're customer facing, I think but some of the things that I actually mentioned in the legislation is, when you're customer facing, is definitely, it's left that responsibility on the employer to make it mandatory or not. It's left that responsibility on the employer to actually move you around within the organization to make sure that you still stay employed. But it hasn't really outline the merits around, the mandatoriness of the vaccination and whether it should be made mandatory or not. And I think in future as well, it's around that compensation. I think Jason actually highlighted it quite well earlier on. It's around that compensation and where does it fall, or where does it start and stop around the workplace? If I'm working from home, where does it start and stop? If I'm filing for maybe my taxes and stuff like that, and I'm working from home and I'm using my lights on an everyday basis, where does it start and stop? So yeah, I think it's around that as well when it comes to the hybrid model. But more so, I think we are. I don't know. Yeah, we are going to actually expect, or we are expecting some sort of legislation to come in that clearly outlines the merits around vaccination, and clearly outlines the merits around when it's supposed to be mandatory and when it's not supposed to be mandatory, and not just leave it on the employer's discretion to actually, put that across.
Sipamanda Ngobo, content creator at LexisNexis South Africa. I will take those as your closing remarks before I get to Andrew Mason and Jason White as we run up to the top of the hour. Just a reminder of that poll that we have been running, and if I could just ask the technical side of the team to put that poll up again, just to remind you to fill it out. So it gives us, as I say, valuable intelligence, valuable information as we plan further webinars. So we'll get that poll up for you in just a moment. In the meantime, though, let me come to Andrew Mason. Andrew, going forward then for an organization, what, in your opinion, are the key metrics then that we will need to employ when it comes to creating a better workplace? What should organizations be looking at in the short term?
Okay, so I think, in the last decade, we've definitely seen an incessant effort to driving down occupancy costs, and I don't think anybody needs to validate why we would do that. But if Peter Drucker has taught us one thing, is that if you measure only cost, that's all that's going to be managed. So this is, I think, driven a myopic effect that the workplace is seen as a cost to be minimized rather than a value to be maximized. Yes, certainly more people in less space is greater efficiency, or produces greater efficiency. But has this been effective? No, and it hasn't. And this densification in our workspaces has taken a terrible toll on productivity, which over the same period has only increased, according to Gallup, by 4%, despite all the massive advances we've had in technology. These spaces have been withering for years, and we all seen the debate of open plan versus closed offices, etc. And I think this has resulted in incorrect thinking. The bottom line is that concentrating on saving costs without the understanding of the consequences demonstrates poor business acumen and a significant risk to the business. The workplace is an enabler of core business and is thus mission critical. The problem up until now has been that no one has been able to provide a nice ROI for the workplace, that sort of bottom right-hand box on an Excel spreadsheet that our CFOs love so much. So what we have developed in our tool that you can see up here, an ROI tool, and that productivity potential is up to 30 times bigger than operational costs that management traditionally have focused on. So an increase of as little as 3.5% in organizational performance can totally offset your operational costs, meaning you could run your facilities for free. So in terms of metrics, what we need to do is have an integration between work performance, workforce performance, and workplace performance, and how you tie those together that looks at the workplace and how it creates and retains customers, how it attracts and retains outstanding people, how it contributes to effective business processes. So it's really getting that integration. Those are the metrics that really should matter most.
And while we quoting the father of management consultants, Peter Drucker, Andrew, to each other, let me throw another one right back at you. And he said, if you want to predict the future, You've got to create the future, and I guess you've got to create it right now. Andrew Mason, Workplace Fundi, 30 years experience on the front line of managing facilities in workplaces. Thank you very much for joining us. Jason White, I'm going to end with you. Do you believe, I wonder, whether the pandemic is going to increase worker interest in collective action and organization? And if your answer is yes, in what form?
Well, I think it's quite a tricky question to answer, simply because when workers tend to organize collectively, it's in more traditional industrial workplaces which haven't been impacted by the new way of doing things. But if we take, for example, a large financial services institution where there are trade unions prevalent, I think we might see an increase in interest in that type of action, simply because you can organize online. You don't have to have a physical meeting anymore. It might lead to some quite interesting developments in the law of strikes. Is striking now simply as easy as refusing to log on in the morning? I think those are all things that are completely unprecedented. It's going to be absolutely fascinating watching these develop and seeing the creative juices flowing.
Jason White, thank you very much indeed. Member of the Law Society of South Africa's Labour Law Committee, also Director at Norton Rose Fulbright, South Africa Incorporated. Thank you very much indeed. Collectively, I want to thank all of our panelists this morning. Some important insight, and I know that I'm not an expert in this, but I always come away from these sessions a lot richer intellectually than when I started. Thank you to the Law Society of South Africa for its partnership with LexisNexis in this webinar series. To our attendees, I trust that you've got something out of the session and you're feeling perhaps a little better, a little bit more mollified in creating your own thriving workplace going forward. A reminder, if you haven't yet downloaded that Legal Tech Report 2021-22 or viewed the previous webinars, LexisNexis can send you the links. We'll do that in the next couple of days. If you want to participate or join in future webinars, lexisnexis.co.za/webinars. So it just leaves me to say from myself, I'm Jeremy Maggs from the Law Society of South Africa and also LexisNexis. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye until the next State of the Legal Industry webinar. It's been stimulating, it's been fun, and thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye now.